You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for August 28th, 2020. This week, more on the cardiac effects of COVID, lessons learned from the convalescent plasma story, outcomes in single-payer versus private health systems, and a preview of the ESC, European Society of Cardiology. First, a couple of announcements. I had a chance to look at some of the reviews of the podcast, and they are very kind. Thank you. I speak into this mic every week and wonder, who's listening? What do people think? It means a lot to me that some of you take the time to write comments. Second, many of you reached out to wish me well. Thanks also for this. I am feeling better. I rode about 200K last weekend, and I'm getting back to running as well. I haven't had the gumption to go on the A ride yet, but I'm getting close. Okay, let's go to the podcast. I normally lead with COVID numbers. I can't do it this week. I have COVID fatigue. Suffice it to say, it is bad. My granddaughter struggles with virtual school, and she has the full support from a highly educated grandparent. Imagine kids who are less fortunate. It is bad. I cannot wait for COVID to ease up. First topic is an explainer on cardiac effects in COVID, and I cannot believe it, but we have to talk again about the controversial JAMA Cardiology cardiac MRI after COVID recovery study. My friend, Dr. Anish Koka, cardiologist in Philadelphia, has authored an excellent piece on the dubious science surrounding the cardiac effects of coronavirus. Take a look at his essay on theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. The stimulus for Dr. Koka's writing such a nice explainer is that U.S. college football programs and the NCAA have cited dubious scientific reasons for canceling their season, including the cardiac MRI study. Now, I revisit this topic not because college sports are so popular. The important issues for cardiologists and any medical people are A, the specifics of the matter of cardiac involvement with the virus, B, the critical appraisal of science, and C, the utter necessity of accurate science communication in the public. So a couple of facts from this week. As of yesterday, the JAMA Cardiology paper had nearly 600,000 views and an altmetric score of 10,000. Altmetric scores indicate general interest and reflects media attention. These are just mind-boggling huge numbers. Another fact. Nearly immediately after publication, Daryl Francis and Graham Cole from Imperial College, among a handful of others, noted that the numbers in the main table were mathematically impossible. An example was something as simple as the IQRs surrounding age. They were simply too narrow to be true. Now, these revelations led to a rapid review of the paper, and this week JAMA Cardiology published a revised paper and letter of explanation from the authors. These documents say the main findings are upheld, but I don't think this is true. We have to go back to Daryl Francis's Twitter timeline, and I'll link to it. He shows recently the before and after papers. The short story in all this is that yes, the numbers were corrected, the IQRs were changed to something else, but something happened to the main findings of the paper, the T1 abnormalities seen on the scans. Here, the number of controls with abnormal findings doubled. The number of RF controls went from 23 to 33. And now for the key point. This is the most important. The authors run a p-value on the 3 columns, 1 recovered COVID, 2 normals, and 3 RF controls, and that was a significant p-value. But isn't this totally wrong? COVID patients are mostly middle-aged or older. You have to compare the post-infection MRI to those matched with risk factors. And if you do that, 73% of 100 COVID recoveries had abnormal T1, 58% of 57 non-COVID with similar risk factors had abnormalities. And Francis calculated the p-value, which is no longer significant. So my friends, other than the pandemic itself, this story has to be one of the top 10 cardiology stories of the year. I have not been this humbled in a long time. In summary, a major journal publishes a small, non-randomized study of cardiac MRI after a viral infection. No one really knows what a cardiac MRI would look like after a severe viral infection from, say, parainfluenza or human metapneumovirus or influenza itself. The original paper gets more than 500,000 views. Media goes ballistic over it. But nearly all the data in the main table is just wrong, mathematically impossible. 995,000 people, many of whom are learned doctors, do not see it, me included. Yes, I saw the obvious clinical problems like low numbers, no randomization, unknown significance of these MRI findings, and the use of the peculiar control like normal people. But I did not see the obvious mathematical irregularities. The peer reviewers did not, the editors did not. The paper gets cited as a reason to curtail college sports. I have even heard that cardiology groups discuss doing MRI scans in post-COVID patients, not for research, but as a revenue stream. What this saga says to me about being a doctor who wants to use the best evidence for his patients is that we have to work much, much harder at not being bamboozled. I, for one, am going to save and restudy Professor Francis's original tweets on the IQR and standard deviation and the normal curve. I have to become more facile with these numbers and the normal distribution. Now, another recommendation, especially to my younger listeners, is to come to medical science with skeptical priors. Not cynical ones, just skeptical. And the reason is that true progress in medicine is hard. Major advances like antibiotics and childhood vaccines and dialysis and the permanent pacemaker, these are rare events. I mean, look at remdesivir. One study made it look good, others not so much, and we still haven't heard the longer-term follow-up on the positive remdesivir study. I had a phase in my career when I thought being a doctor was easy. I'm like, John, you have this down. But the older I get, the more I realize the hubris in that. The older I get, the more I think doctoring is really hard, and it demands more, not less, of our attention. Second topic, briefly, is convalescent plasma. Now, speaking of dubious science, we need to briefly review this convalescent plasma study, and we'll do it apolitically. Last weekend, Dr. Steve Hahn, the FDA commissioner, gave a news conference in which he presented the results of an observational, non-randomized study from the Mayo Group. The study was from a preprint, not even peer-reviewed. Convalescent plasma was donated by recently recovered COVID-19 survivors, and the antibody levels in the units collected were unknown at the time of the transfusion. The authors found a gradient of mortality in relation to the antibody levels that was in the transfused plasma. High antibodies did better than medium, did better than low. And the pooled relative risk of mortality among patients transfused with high antibody level was 0.65 for 7 days. Now, when Hahn mixed up the relative and absolute risk reductions, he turned a hazard ratio of 0.65 into a 35% absolute risk reduction, and he told the world that convalescent plasma would save 35 out of 100 people given the agent. Now, this is an egregious mistake for a medical student. But for an FDA commissioner to make this mistake, it really makes one have cynical thoughts. He did correct the error later in the week. But the real tragedy of convalescent plasma is that tens of thousands, maybe more, have received it, but we have no earthly idea if it works. This is because to know if something works, especially in a disease that most people recover from, is that you have to have an adequate control and a proper blinding. The FDA, in my opinion, blew the opportunity to explain to the American public why an observational study cannot tell you if something really works and why randomized controlled trials are so vital. I mean, Fauci has talked about RCTs all the time, but I'm not sure he really explains why. I've said numerous times the American people are not stupid. It would help them so much to understand the notion of trials. For instance, if you inculcated such a strategy in the public, you could then promote RCTs to study lots of different things, even policy things. You could have a pilot RCT of different healthcare reform programs. You could have RCTs of different educational systems. So I guess if I was a political activist, I would advocate for more RCTs in policy matters. Third topic today is cardiac procedures done in the VA system versus the community. Specifically, PCI. Now, Jack published a provocative observational study comparing outcomes after PCI for stable coronary disease in the VA system versus community hospitals. This is an important question because the VA system is essentially a single-payer, NHS-like system embedded within the U.S. healthcare system. Many Americans falsely believe such a system is inherently inferior. In recent years, both politicians and veterans raised concerns the VA system cannot always accomplish timely care, and a solution to that would be to let veterans seek care outside the VA. Now, one more background issue. There is a general feeling among some that private systems provide better care. I, for one, think that is wrong. Now, this study involved 9,000 patients, 2/3 of whom had PCI in the VA system and 1/3 out in the community. The patients treated in the community had a 33% higher death rate. The hazard ratio was 1.33. The confidence intervals go from 1.09 to 1.62. There was early separation of the curves, which could suggest differences in the safety of the procedure, or, as I will mention in a moment, that could indicate that sicker patients were done in the community. Of course, the question in any non-random comparisons like this is confounding. The authors used a hypothetical model to estimate the size of the baseline differences that could account for the sizable difference in mortality. Basically, they suggested if a confounder was present, for example, sicker patients went to the community, it would have to be a very big difference, and this is unlikely. So 2 more thoughts on this study. While some might have the idea that care in a VA is less than that in private systems, I doubt it. I work in the private system, and I'm not always impressed. I think the VA system might actually be better. The VA offers continuity of care. They are not incentivized to overtreat. So here is a study findings that aligns with my beliefs. And I could say, look, veterans do worse if they leave the VA and go to the community. 33% higher chance of dying. But again, I would be wrong to do this. The care in the VA might be better, but due to the limitations of this study, I don't think one can say that. In addition to the non-randomized comparisons and likely confounding, the authors tell us that they used actual medical records for documenting outcomes in the VA, but they had to use admin databases for the community hospital group. That's not equal. I'm surprised that Jack did not force the authors to expand more on this hypothetical model of estimating the confounding. I'm not a stats person, but it seems we ought to have more weight given to adjustments for baseline differences. Finally, and this is the key point, given the results of ischemia trial and every single RCT before ischemia, which showed no added benefit in outcomes with PCI for stable coronary disease, perhaps the longer waiting times in the VA is actually an ideal thing. Final topic today is an ESC preview. ESC, of course, is the European Society of Cardiology. It is with great sadness that I preview my favorite meeting. I am sad because I will not get to see my friends and not commute in conference clothes on a bike in one of my favorite cities in Europe. Of course, my favorite city in Europe is Rzeszów, Poland. Nonetheless, ESC, like all other medical meetings, has moved online. That said, we'll still learn the results of some important trials. The lead one, I think, is Emperor Reduced, which is the second RCT of an SGLT2 inhibitor for patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. We already know from a press release that the empagliflozin versus placebo trial met its primary endpoint of CV death and heart failure hospitalizations. Now, we don't know by how much. The magnitude of the benefit is important because dapagliflozin looked quite impressive in the DAPA-HF trial. Now, speaking of SGLT2 inhibitors and the DAPA-HF study, ESC will also feature the DAPA-CKD trial. There's 4,000 patients testing whether DAPA preserves kidney function in patients with CKD. Now, I know this is a kidney outcomes trial, but if positive by a lot, then the drug class gets even more momentum. A note on SGLT2 inhibitors from here in the real world. I have not seen it used much by cardiologists. I called two of my partners who focus on heart failure care, and they have used the drug in patients with heart failure, but not in non-diabetics yet. Both expressed positive experiences. Both said the drug had an especially potent diuretic effect, but both of my colleagues cited pill burden and cost concerns. So at the end of ESC, look for commentary on how the big trials affect when to start the drug relative to the other guideline-directed medical therapy that we use in patients with heart failure. Now, another big study I'm looking at is the EAST AFNet trial. This is a pragmatic multicenter RCT in patients with AFib, and it will study the effect of early rhythm control versus usual care. The fascinating part of EAST is that rhythm control in EAST could be either antiarrhythmic drugs or ablation. Now, the trial has two co-primary endpoints, and given the pragmatic nature, rhythm control is left up to the investigators. Interpretation of this is going to be really hard. That said, the seminal AFFIRM trial done many years ago clearly showed that rhythm control offered no benefits over rate control in older patients who were minimally symptomatic. I think that rhythm control deserves more respect than it gets. While sinus rhythm is definitely preferred, getting there can be hazardous. Drug side effects and procedural complications are no small thing. There will be many, many more studies to talk about at ESC. I wrote a preview. Journalist Patrice Wendling wrote a better preview. Take a look at these two and tune into our coverage this weekend and next week. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a rating, subscribing, writing a review. All of these things help others find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.